So I did my book report on nonviolent communications by Marshall Rosenberg. A little bit about the book and about the author. Marshall was a mediator and a psychologist. Used the talents very often with tribes and people who are struggling with conflict that usually resulted in a violent dispute. Hence the name nonviolent communication. This book kind of takes the reader on a journey of how the proper way to communicate is and what that looks like. So one of the biggest topics of this book was, why do we feel the need? Why do we feel the need to be violent in situations that don't necessarily call for it? A big part of this book that was stressed is that there's no need for violence in any kind of situation, whether that be, with murder, horrible crimes that have been committed. There's nothing that we can justify violent acts towards. Why people have that feeling of violence is really a need for control, power, domination, because it makes someone who is in control feel that release of anxiety when they have control over people, and a way to get that result without really having to self-center is through violence. Another big part of this book that was the second step is needs. That through all types and forms of communication, there are needs that need to be met, whether that be better communication, better living standards, anything that could be communicated as a need is really the basis behind any kind of communication. That through communication there are needs that need to be met in order for a person to feel respected and loved. A really big part of this book is about compassion, and how we as humans naturally have the ability to let compassion flow, and that is actually our natural way of communicating. As well as respect. I think respect comes with compassion. You need to be respectful of people in order to have compassion for them. So an excerpt from this book that I wrote. I'm just going to read some highlights and kind of explain why they're important to me and why I highlighted it. We are led to express ourselves with honesty and clarity while simultaneously paying others a respectful and empathetic attention. In any exchange, we come to hear our own deeper needs. So I think another big topic of this book that was very important to me was all about self-evaluation. I think that is the first key that needs to be met when starting to communicate with someone. I think it's very easy at times to fall away from what we're really trying to say and what we're really trying to get at, and it can be confusing and it is hard. I know for me personally, in order to get my message across, I definitely need to take a minute for myself to really think about what it is that I'm trying to communicate and what needs I need to be met, or what needs for me need to be met in order for me to also feel respected. It's a mutual partnership in this book, and that's talked about quite often, and given examples of people who have come to Marshall and talked about issues that they're having in with marriage or workplace issues, and how they were resolved by using his communication style and form. So back to the self-evaluation part. This is another excerpt from the book that I took that I felt was very helpful and kind of rammed home all those things that I was trying to explain. First, we observe what is actually happening in a situation. What we are observing others saying or doing is either enriching or not enriching our life. The trick is to be able to articulate this. So a big part of this book, and a thing that Marshall had to develop when communicating and mediating these African tribes, was to take what people are saying and find the need behind it. What they're really trying to say, what needs need to be met, how safety can be implemented, and how nonviolent ways or punishments, how those can be avoided. Another thing that was interesting to talk about was why we feel the need to label people as either good or bad, or helpful, not helpful, how we put labels on people, and that it's not really fair to do that, because we're not coming about communication in a relationship from a place of compassion, where when we let that natural compassion flow within us, we can find those good things and those good aspects about people that we may overstep initially when having a conversation, or with that first initial judgment. So another part about self-evaluation that I felt was most important was trying to understand why people are the way they are, and what has made them that way. In my own personal experience, this nonviolent communication and talk of control is somewhat of a form of communication that I'm used to in my own family setting. Not in a violent sense by any means, but a very dominated style of communication that is hard to be receptive to, and hard to not to want to take liberties, I guess you'd say, and overstep boundaries at times. And even the idea of letting anger flow naturally is okay. I mean, that is something I've been used to, and that's something that this book has helped prove to me that that's not the correct way to communicate with anybody, whether that be classmates, brothers, mother, father, teachers. The list goes on and on. So, like I said, in my own experience, there have been reasons that have made people in my own family be the way they are, whether it be sickness, injuries, the ups and downs of life. I think there are a lot of things that make people a little bit, I guess you'd say, salty towards people around them, and towards life, and that people are always out to try and get them. So another part about needs is the feelings behind those needs. Why do we feel the need to deserve what we believe we deserve? And the hard part about that is putting yourself in someone else's shoes while also trying to understand what you personally want. I think with all communication, it really stems from a place of companionship. Obviously, you can't communicate with yourself. I mean, you can in something like a self-evaluation, but for most of the lessons we've learned in this class and in this book, it's all about communicating with others instead of yourself, obviously. Let me find another excerpt I'd like to talk about. So the NVC, so nonviolent communication process, the concrete actions we observe that affect our well-being, how we feel in relation to what we observe, the needs, values, desires, as I was talking about, that create our feelings. The concrete actions that's all I highlighted. So like I was saying, it really is about why we feel those needs, and our ability to communicate that to other people. I think my favorite part of all of this was the compassion that comes along, and that it's nothing that we aren't already equipped with. I think that was the most interesting part of this book, was that compassion is the natural flow of communication, and with compassion comes love and respect, and the things I spoke of earlier. But that was kind of an eye-opener for me, in a way that, we are already equipped with this natural ability to not only show love for others, but to show love for yourself. And that no matter what situation it is, there can always be found a middle ground for both people, where needs are being met. Another part of this book was that violence and anger, not violence, but anger, is a natural reaction to how we feel about certain situations in certain times, but how we can express that in a way that is mutually beneficial, and let it not reflect what's going on inside of you. A part of this book also, in the expressing anger chapter, was that when you're actually angry and upset and lashing out at people, it's not a reflection of what the others have done, it's a reflection of what's going on internally. And it's been proven to not be constructive at all. It's actually shown that it drives relationships apart. And I think that's because it's not a place of compassion and love. That's kind of what this book talks about and stresses a lot, where if that violence or anger is that form of communication that's being used to build relationships, it's almost impossible, or it is impossible, and that dysfunctions come along with that. I think also another part that was important to me is that dysfunction is a part of all of us. I think that was talked about in this book, how we all have certain issues and certain things that we might not necessarily like about ourselves or like about our partner, but it's really about understanding those dysfunctions and knowing how to combat them. I think it's really helpful to have a partner, someone that you care about deeply, to kind of help identify those things. I think a big part of self-evaluation, which was most important to me, was letting people in and being vulnerable, even in times where it's not easy to be vulnerable. I think a big part of this class that was most refreshing to me and taught me the most was, you can learn these principles of how to communicate properly and how to take the steps. But I think one of the biggest things for me that, at least I didn't hear in anyone else's book report, was that it's a process that takes a lot of time. I don't think these principles and these philosophies can be implemented or really truly fully absorbed and learned in a semester of taking a communications class. I think it has definitely built a very solid foundation for me and kind of given me all the tools. But I think at the end of the day, and that's why self-evaluation was very important to me, is being honest with yourself on where you're at in those relationships. How are you communicating? What are your styles? What do you revert to when you're upset or when you're sad? Or do you withdraw? Do you attack at times? All different kinds of communication skills. And I think we talked about this. Well, we did talk about this at the end of class, that you will try and you will continue to fall on your face. A big part of this book was being persistent, and like I said, really taking your needs and others' needs into consideration and giving it your best effort to try and make a relationship work that is healthy and it doesn't validate violent tendencies, that you can step away from and really have a more energy conserved conversation, because more is being said with less words and less emotions behind it. Overall, this class and this book really helped kind of set the foundation for how I want to be able to communicate, and the style of communication that I found is the most healthy and the least redundant. I think I would definitely read this book, or recommend reading this book or letting other people read this book, just because I think violence and anger and the idea that bad people should be punished is a universal truth. I think most people, when they see bad things happening, they want retribution, or they want justice to be filled, even if that means violence. When, like how I've said, and this book has taught me, violence or anger and punishment at times is never really necessary. Like how I said, it's more of a reflection of how you feel and how you're upset on the inside. Grateful to have read this book and to have learned a lot about myself and the teachings that can be taken from this. But like how I said, it's a matter of effort and time, and it will take time, longer than a few months. And this was something that I believe everybody struggles with all of the time. I don't think it's something that can be learned and implemented at all times. I think there are times when people let their emotions get the best of them, and I'm glad to have read this book. So thank you, and I appreciate it.